Hey everyone, this is writing micro lesson number 1 on developing ideas for Honors 111 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine. And I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So I want to say just a little bit about the philosophy that is driving my approach to writing education and this series of assignments that you'll be engaged in this semester. So the book that you see on the left-hand side is called the Checklist Manifesto. And the man that you see on the right-hand side is named Atul Gawande. He is a cancer surgeon, he is a public health researcher, and he's a really phenomenal writer. Has been featured in all sorts of publications like the New Yorker and the Atlantic, and has written a series of really good books. Some of them about public health, and some of them ostensibly about health, but stretching far beyond that. And the Checklist Manifesto is a good example. So the subtitle of Checklist Manifesto is How to Get Things Right. And specifically, what motivated Atul Gawande to write this book was his recognition that there were a number of complications, patient death, infections that he was seeing in his career as a health professional that he felt could have been prevented if there was some sort of systematic approach to healthcare and some sort of way to avoid what seemed to be simple mistakes or oversights. And so he started to look at other professions, other areas of human activity, and see how they're approaching complex processes and what they do to avoid errors. So he looked at airline pilots, he looked at structural engineers building buildings, a host of different professions and areas. And what he found is that the professions with the lowest rate of error and the lowest number of mistakes seem to be approaching their complex tasks in really systematic ways, oftentimes utilizing checklists. So for example, with air travel, the pilots go through a pretty exhaustive series of checklists before they even turn on the airplane. And the reason that they're doing that is because any simple oversight, any minor mistake that they make could result in, something really serious happening that could result in loss of life. And so he took those ideas back to healthcare, back to operating rooms and emergency rooms, and he found that when there is this systematic approach utilizing a checklist to medical care, the rate of error, the rate of infection, the rate of complication just dramatically falls. And so the book is actually a larger argument for the importance of being systematic in your approach to anything. And so I started to think about this when I read this book a few years ago. I started to think about writing. And writing is a complex process. Writing involves a series of steps. Writing involves being systematic. You obviously want to be creative and somewhat spontaneous as well, but I thought that utilizing this more systematic approach could be really helpful, especially as we try to learn the fundamentals. And that's what we'll be doing in Honors 111. We'll be using this philosophy and this idea to try to be more systematic in our writing. So our goal throughout this semester will be to develop and utilize a set of basic skills and practices to make you all better writers, to make their use systematic in your writing. And then we'll actually build a checklist for how to think about writing, specifically argumentative and analytical writing. So you're in argumentative writing, you're advancing a claim and defending it with evidence. And in analytical writing, you're engaged in some form of analysis or maybe comparison between two different texts or multiple texts, multiple ideas. So that's the type of writing that we'll be focusing on, and that's our larger goal for the semester. So today we're going to start with just idea development. Obviously, before you write, you have to have an idea. You have to know what you want to say and situate your ideas in relation to others. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So the first thing that I want to introduce is this idea of dialectical thinking. So the picture that you see on the left-hand side is a kitten, and it is the logo for the hardcore metal band Slayer, which they've been around for decades. They've been around since I was a kid. And what does this have to do with dialectical thinking? Well, a few years ago, the band Slayer was on tour, and there was a kitten that was hanging around their tour bus, and they ended up adopting the kitten and taking it on the road with them. And they would, be on stage, and then they would get off stage and go to their tour bus and play with this adorable little kitten. And it kind of confounds your expectations. You wouldn't think that this hardcore metal band with really kind of gritty, loud music and, tattoos and long hair, and you wouldn't think that they would be rushing off stage to go play with a kitten, but that is in fact true. And there's something that kind of defies our expectations there and brings into contact two very different expectations. So that, I think, ties into dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking is the idea that there are multiple valid ways to interpret a situation or approach a question. If you're engaged in dialectical thinking, you are resisting the conventional wisdom. So there may be widespread, widely held ideas about a certain question or a certain topic, but you're going to interrogate and critically question those ideas before you arrive at your own understanding. Dialectical thinking recognizes that change and complexity are constant, and instead of trying to shut them down or deny that they're there, it actually embraces that complexity. And it's also a recognition that two ideas that appear to be opposites can actually both be true, right? So dialectical thinking, I think, will be helpful, particularly in regard to the types of texts and the types of questions that we confront in honors, which often have no simple, definitive, singular answer. So how do you engage in dialectical thinking? Well, if you're writing or you're just thinking about a text, developing your ideas, the first thing that you might want to do is ask yourself, what do you believe, right? So what do you believe in regard to justice, for example? And then think about radically different ways that others might interpret justice. And say, what is true in those other radically different ways of viewing the situation? Don't dismiss them altogether. Don't say they're hopelessly wrong, and so therefore you don't have to think about them. But think about their underlying assumptions and the claims that they're making, and what do you find to be true there? In general, engaging in dialectical thinking means overturning these sort of either-or formulations and recognizing that very complex questions can have a both-and answer, right? It's not black or white. It's some combination of both. In looking at literature or philosophy or a scientific text, you'll ask, how do the characters or the ideas defy expectations? How do they embody something but also contain its opposite? And in general, you want to push back on always or never formulations, right? It's very rarely the case that something is always X, Y, or Z or never X, Y, or Z. So you want to temper that with sometimes and then think about those exceptions. What are the exceptions that would justify a qualifier where you say it's actually not always the case that whatever it might be. Sometimes there are exceptions. So engaging in dialectical thinking is really, it's about flexibility. It's about seeing validity in other views and trying to recognize what is valid in those other views and incorporate it into your own thinking. Now, part of developing your own ideas is situating the ideas of others. And so one of the things that you'll need to do in Honors 111 and in honors generally is situate ideas, right? So when you encounter the ideas of others, you can ask yourself three questions. One, what is the claim? Two, what is the context? And three, who is the intended consumer, right? So 3 C's. And I'll actually give you an example of this. So here you have a quote from Just Mercy, The Honors Read by Brian Stevenson, a book in which he's looking at justice, he's looking at race and the criminal justice system, mass incarceration. He is reflecting on his work representing those on death row who have been condemned to die for terrible crimes. And specifically here, he's talking about Walter McMillan, who is a man that sat on death row for a very long time and eventually was exonerated. They found out that he was not involved in his crime and set him free. And so he's reflecting on what he's learned from Walter. He says, Walter had taught me that mercy is just when it is rooted in hopefulness and freely given. Mercy is most empowering, liberating, and transformative when it is directed at the undeserving. So you can ask yourself those three questions there. What is the claim? What is the context? And who are the consumers? Well, the claim is about mercy and its relationship to justice. And he's actually creating kind of a hierarchy. He's saying, the most powerful form of mercy, the way that one is empowered by mercy, the way that one is freed, the way that one is transformed by an act of mercy, is when it is directed at one who is undeserving, right? So specifically here, Walter had forgiven the people who had put him on death row and forgiven those that had wronged him. And he thought that was a very powerful act, right? So there's a claim being made there about mercy and its relationship to justice. Obviously, the context is his work, representing clients on death row, and in this case, representing an innocent man on death row and trying to get him out of prison and off of death row. And the consumers are, it's probably directed at an American audience. He's probably wanting individuals to think about mass incarceration and the criminal justice system in the United States and perhaps seek changes and call for changes. In a larger sense, it's directed at anyone who wants to ask larger questions about the relationship between justice and mercy. It's not specifically tied to an American context. These are larger questions that really all of humanity has to face. But it is embedded in the context of his work in the criminal justice system, and one would think that part of his motivation in sharing his story is to seek change and to try to reform what he sees as wrong with the system. So in answering those three questions, you understand a lot more about this claim. You've situated the ideas in such a way that then you can really grapple with it and think about whether or not you agree. Much of what you'll be doing in writing is responding to the ideas of others. And so that requires you to develop your own ideas. And there's a couple different ways that you can do that, right? So developing your own ideas, it entails figuring out where you stand in relation to a claim. And that's harder than simply situating it. You have to think about, what is it that I believe? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Do I agree, but there needs to be some sort of qualification, or what has been presented here, the idea that's been presented here, is incomplete, right? So that's more difficult. That requires real active thought. I'll give you a couple examples of how you could do this with the specific quote that I just gave you from Stevenson. So perhaps you're on board, right? So you agree, but you don't want to simply agree, right? There should be kind of some value added to what you're presenting for your ideas. So you could say, yes, Stevenson is right in regard to mercy and criminal justice. Such ideas also apply to war and foreign policy, right? So maybe, there's the context in which Stevenson is speaking, but actually we could also think about this in relation to how we interact with countries throughout the world and how we try to project our image abroad in foreign policy. And there too, mercy is most transformative and liberating and empowering when it's directed at those who don't deserve it. You could say you disagree, right? But then you have to justify why. So you read Stevenson's quote and you say, no, actually, his quote is compelling, but this expansive notion of mercy is dangerous and would undermine our notion of consequences for terrible actions. So there, you're reading Stevenson's quote, you're acknowledging that it's well written and powerful, but you're saying, actually, that's a very dangerous road to go down. And if we employ that expansive notion of mercy on a societal level, it could mean that there are no consequences for bad actions. And that's a perfectly valid point of view. And then you could say, okay, but, right? You could say, yes, I agree, but this is incomplete. So here you would say Stevenson's notion of mercy is powerful, but the reality is that most of us would struggle and fail to achieve such an ideal. So it's a powerful ideal. It's something we should strive towards, but most of us are going to fail to get there, right? So that's just some examples of how to situate the ideas that you'll encounter, and then how you might think about responding to them, either in class discussion or in your writing. Idea development is something that you'll be working on the entirety of your career in honors and the entirety of your time as a college student, really your entire life. So there's some additional guidance on idea development. The idea of dialectical thinking, there's a handout available on Blackboard that goes into this in much more detail and lays out exactly what is dialectical thinking. There's also a book that's, I think, really helpful in terms of situating your ideas in relation to others. It's called They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing. And the situating ideas in relation to one another, a lot of that material that I've just presented to you quickly here is dealt with in much more detail in that book. And there's a number of different editions. So I think the most recent edition is the 3rd edition, but you could get an earlier edition probably a little bit cheaper, and it would have the same sort of content explaining these ideas about how to situate your ideas in relation to others, and also lots of just really helpful advice on conventions in academic writing, what's expected at the college level and beyond. So I recommend those two handouts if you're looking for additional guidance on idea development. We'll wrap up there for this first micro lesson, and you have an assignment in which you'll actually be engaged in idea development. So I look forward to reading your first weekly writing assignment. Thanks very much.